We're really delighted to have Neil Bergmann with us. And Neil recently retired as an academic in computer engineering. And he also recently completed a master's in theology on the topic of eco-theology. And he's actually currently the chair of the Lutheran Earth Care Committee of the Lutheran Church of Australia and New Zealand. And your topic, Neil, is a dialogue-based Christian theology of science. It's really great to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. So a lot of, 1990, Ian Barbour presented 4 different ways in which science and religion could relate to each other. So there's ones of conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. And many other writers have used this typology, or particular disagreement with it, as a starting point for discussion of the relationship between science and religion, or for our audience today, perhaps between Christian theology and science. We can look at these sort of 2 straw man proposals. So if we look at the viewpoint of atheistic scientists, religions, including Christianity, seem little more than superstitious remnants from a less enlightened, less scientific past. Scientists believe, perhaps correctly, that the metaphysical truth claims of Christianity can never be proven scientifically. However, they believe incorrectly that therefore these metaphysical truths have no validity, value, or utility. If you go to the next slide, if we take the opposite pole from the viewpoint of fundamentalist Christians, scientific truth claims that conflict with naive literal biblical interpretations are equally invalid. In some cases, this extends to pseudoscientific alternative explanations for generally accepted scientific theories, such as a 13 billion-year-old universe and the evolution of life on Earth. So most, if not all, of this audience would sit between these 2 epistemological poles, often living with unresolved and perhaps unresolvable tensions between the physical and the metaphysical worlds. And this tension can be particularly acute for scientists who are also Christians. If we go to the next slide. So where does God's place fit in all this? God can be thought of as hidden in creation, ever present, but with an existence that cannot be scientifically proven. Therefore, some would argue that God should be excluded altogether from proper scientific study. So Andrew Torrance from St Andrews refers to 2 ways in which this might be achieved. The so-called methodological atheism, and this is an approach that scientific inquiry should be done assuming God doesn't exist. It doesn't mean the people who are doing it assume God doesn't exist, but for that part of their life where they're doing science, they assume God doesn't exist as part of their experiments. Or methodological naturalism is an approach that assumes that the observable universe can be explained solely in terms or solely by the study of natural phenomena. These beliefs are only applied when the scientific study is being undertaken, and this perhaps fits with Barbour's category of science and religion being independent domains. Torrance goes on to argue that neither of these approaches is a suitable way for Christian scientists to approach their work. So Barbour's 4th category of integration, if we go to the next slide, yes. This 4th category of integration covers those approaches which seek to show that science and religion together are both needed to understand the observable universe, including the actions and motivations of the humans that inhabit Earth. Immediate difficulty with this approach is which religion is it that we would integrate with science? For the major world religions don't share the same truth claims and doctrines. Christianity has truth claims about God's ongoing actions in the world that are regularly appealed to through personal and corporate prayer, and which are difficult to integrate with scientifically observable cause and effect. Go to the next slide. So he sort of said that maybe conflict doesn't work, independence doesn't work, integration maybe doesn't work. So that leaves our this idea of dialogue, and that's the sort of basis of this talk. So Tom McLeish argues that rather than rehashing a discussion of theology and science, perhaps a better way forward might be to try and develop a theology of science. He argues that science and theology are both theories of everything, in the sense that there's no area of our understanding that is excluded from theological or scientific inquiry. A theology of science, then, is a systematized study of what, as Christians, we believe about science as a way of understanding the world. It's a view from a Christian perspective towards science, in the same way that we might think of philosophy of religion as a view from a scientific or philosophical perspective about what is thought of religion. Somewhat surprisingly, at least to me, there's not all that much that's written on a theology of science, and certainly not that many presentations of theology. We go to the next slide. Yeah, McLeish develops his theology of science from several different strands of thought. He firstly explores a link between current societal mistrust of science and sees these as reflections of ancient pre-Christian narratives of despair, things like Pandora's box, looking where you shouldn't be looking. Second is his belief that the secularization of science is a relatively recent, in the last couple of hundred years, so perhaps from the mid-19th century. So it's an aberration, and we have much to learn by going before that to earlier scientists of faith. And thirdly, he places a lot of emphasis on the wisdom narratives, particularly the creation-focused narrative that runs through the book of Job. And finally, he looks at the New Testament message of God's message of reconciliation. And if you go to the next slide, this gives his theology of science in one sentence. So he says, science is the participative, relational, co-creative work within the kingdom of God of healing the fallen relationship of humans with nature. So it's probably worth saying that again. Science is the participative, relational, co-creative work within the kingdom of God of healing the fallen relationship of humans with nature. So this statement is succinct and insightful, but to me it seems unsatisfactorily incomplete. In other words, it doesn't cover all the things I think a theology of science would need to do. We can also look at some other places where this sort of science and theology have come together. We go to the next slide. So this is 1951. This was an address from Pope Pius XII. And he was trying to say, well, how do we understand all those proofs of God that the church previously developed, now that we have a much richer scientific background? And he says, in fact, according to the measure of its progress, and contrary to the affirmations advanced in the past, true science discovers God in an ever-increasing degree, as though God were waiting behind every door opened by science. So this is a version of that integration theology. It says there's no real conflict between the two. Again, I think that's a little naive. If we go to the next slide. The latest one that I've seen is a book by Paul Tyson from University of Queensland. And it's called A Christian Theology of Science, Reimagining a Theological Vision of Natural Knowledge. So I haven't read through the whole book yet. I've looked at the sort of forward that you can get on Google Books, but haven't got a copy of the book yet. But this book seeks to renegotiate the relationship between science and technology for believers. And the sort of key outcome that this book comes up with is it's good both for religion and for science when Christians treat theology as their first truth discourse. This theology informs science as the primary direction of thought development rather than the other way around. Go to the next slide, please. So Alistair McGrath, that we'll see tonight, he has a book, The Science of God, an Introduction to Scientific Theology. So not theology of science, but scientific theology. And this is a summary of 3 much longer and more academic books on the science of God in nature, reality, and theory. And what he does is he looks particularly at how science can inform the development of theology, including, he's got a big list of outcomes, I think 12 of them, but includes things like reaffirmation of doctrine in the Christian life, reaffirmation of the importance of metaphysics, so those bits of our Christian belief that we can't necessarily prove by science, and also this idea of natural theology, that we can learn about God by looking at nature. It's still not quite a theology of science. So, next slide. So that sort of talked a little bit about the background of these talks. What I wanted to do now is talk a little bit about how I would aim to develop a theology of science. So the next slide is, and you probably might be able to read all of this. There's some key points on the following slide, but just there's a method of theological investigation called analytic theology. This is based on analytic philosophy. And this is sometimes sort of called Anglo-American philosophy. So the opposite of continental philosophy. This is, and if you think of people like Bertrand Russell, look very much at logic as a way of describing traits. But if we go to the next slide, the key ones I think that would be relevant are, firstly, that this method prioritizes precision, clarity, and logical coherence. You try and write things as logical assertions that you can manipulate. And secondly, it avoids substantive or non-decorative uses of metaphor. So you don't try and just, this is a very sort of concrete, like this is a Mr. Spock versus Dr. McCoy type. This is more the Mr. Spock method. If we go to the next slide. So there's a number of questions that we need to answer in order to develop a theology of science. So what I wanted to do for the rest of the talk was just go through what some of these questions are and look at what some provisional answers might be. So the first question is there a slide before that one? No? No? Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. So, so firstly, why do we do science? So it could be to understand nature. It could be to understand God. And that was that sort of statement from Pius XII, that by doing science, we understand more about God. It might be an act of worship. Some people have said the sort of Genesis verse about that humanity has dominion over creation. How might that happen? That might be through science and technologies. People argue that way. You saw from Tom McLeish that he wanted to reconcile humanity and nature. It could be that a goal of our existence is human flourishing, if that's sort of your view of Christian ethics. How do we improve human flourishing? Then science and technology might be a way of doing that. Yeah. We go to the next slide. Another way is you just look at what Kurt Vonnegut says. And if I read the sort of non-gendered, if I tell you the non-gendered version rather than his actual words, but if we said, tiger got to hunt, bird got to fly, people got to sit and wonder why. Tiger got to sleep, bird got to land, people got to tell themselves they understand. This is sort of saying fundamentally a part of being a human is being inquisitive and trying to understand the world around, or at least telling ourselves that we understand the world around. So maybe that's a way in which we do science. Just before I do this, I just should say that when I'm talking about, oh no, you can go to the next slide. But when I'm talking about science here, I'm really meaning science and technology. So, and often those two are, we've got two separate words for them, but so science is sometimes seen as the cleaner end of the spectrum. This is where we try and understand and explain what's happening in the world. So we're observing the world in an intentional way, but not necessarily changing the world. So this might be coming up with Maxwell's theory of electromagnetic radiation, or investigating the structure of DNA molecules. And then we have technology which implements and uses those things. So we take Maxwell's equations and we use those to develop radio waves. And it's sort of amazing that Maxwell came up with the equations before anyone had transmitted any radio waves. And then for the structure of DNA, well, it's good to understand that we've got those double helix, but then to be able to manipulate those is a technological thing. And I think we're talking about both of those because we can't really separate science and technology. So another question, which is the one that's on the slide here, is that one of the things that you need to do in any, well, probably it's the area of where conflict occurs, where you have truth claims of science and theology that seem incompatible. So things like evolution versus creation. And yes, you can massage those and get some consistent views of old Earth versus a new Earth. And in fact, it was actually geology, I think, more than evolution, that was the first real test for biblical accuracy, when people found rocks that they could identify as being millions of years old. We've then got ways in which God acts, so God's providential care for humanity. If it's a mechanical universe, how is it that God, you say God provides for us, but how is it we do it? And then the whole area of ethics and of science and technology is an area where there's potentially conflict between, say, biblical statements and current societal beliefs. Go to the next slide. If you have a theology of science, does it say that all science is equally valid, or is there some science which is theologically defensible or indefensible? Are there some things that we shouldn't do because of the way that we understand our Christian beliefs? So genetic manipulation. These all often end up being in that sort of bioethics area, is a place that's particularly fraught here. But ones that we've already saw this morning, so genetic manipulation, and then is it okay to experiment on animals? What about people? And then weapons research. And is theologically defensible different to socially defensible? So do we come up with different answers for some of these? And certainly different people do. Within a Christian community, and there certainly would be differences in some of these areas as well. Yeah, the next slide. If you have a theology of science, a key question is, who's the audience here? So clearly it's for Christians at least, and the idea of Christians is to guide their thoughts and actions. So to give people, particularly say scientists, why do I believe that I'm doing this? Or do I go back and choose methodological atheism to say that, okay, while I'm at work, I'm not going to use God anywhere in these experiments? Or is it to say, when you're doing this work, do you use at least the ethical background to say, why is it that I'm doing this experiment? Is it the way to go? If a model of, sorry, if you just go, if this, and I call this a dialogue-based theology of science, because it's saying that of Barbour's categories, the category of dialogue is perhaps the one that I'm most attracted to. I'm not convinced that integration is necessarily possible. And if it is, I think because it tends to gloss over some of the disagreements. So it's better to actually talk about the disagreements. But in that case, then a theology of science should be able to speak to the broader community as part of the dialogue between Christianity and science. So we go to the next slide. So I've just started looking at some of this work, and in fact, as was mentioned in the introduction, I've recently completed a master's in theology. So this is my first thoughts of where I could go with a doctorate in theology is to look at these sorts of questions. So from that point of view, it's really just at the beginning. So in terms of what I need to do next, the first one is to keep reading, but that's probably the case for any research. This is a fraught area to read well in because there's a whole lot of stuff written on theology and science, and the question is how much of that is particularly relevant. Everything is good, but if you have to be selective in reading, it's sort of hard to find a clear path through which is the most relevant discussion. And as I found out in my master's, the other problem that's different between theology and previous work that I've done in engineering and science, engineering and science, you're pretty safe at going back 10 or 20 years in terms of your reading. With theology, you probably end up going at least back to Aristotle and on from there. So as McLeish mentioned earlier, he used to say it's worth going back and seeing what people did 500 years ago. So the sort of what Newton and those sort of people were looking at. And then the second one is just to refine the 7 questions that need to be answered to come up. So what are all the things you'd like to have in a theology of science? I haven't tried to call it a doctrine of science. I think it's a bit grandiose to call it a doctrine, because that would be saying here's something we think everyone should agree on. But at least what's my theology of science? And how would we go about answering those? I think that's it. Thank you.
That was great. Thanks very much indeed. Yeah, so the first question is, if all truth is God's truth, doesn't that mean reconciliation should also be possible?
Well, yeah, I guess reconciliation or integration. I think there's still fundamental questions. So I'm not sure, particularly ones, the one from, I'm not so worried about the sort of creation versus evolution versus old versus new earth. I think there's ways that we can explain that, just what the purpose of the, for example, the Genesis texts are, which are theology, they're not meant to be science. I think it becomes more difficult if you say, well, okay, so are there metaphysical creatures? Are there angels and spirits and things which act on earth? And if they're metaphysical, that almost by definition means they're unable to be identified by science. So it's difficult to see how you would integrate those two, I think. So that's why I think that there are some fundamental conflicts between a purely naturalistic or materialistic version of science. Of course, you can always extend science to say, well, okay, it's not just that, it's broader than that. Yeah, so that would be my take, is that integration probably rides over some differences, or I can't easily see a way in which those differences would be resolved.
Thank you. Then another one, has your research in this area influenced your work in earth care, I guess, with the Lutheran Church?
So that's an interesting one, which is to say that when you look at, say, the climate crisis, to choose one of the earth care things, because there's of course also biodiversity and pollution, etc. But if you look just at the sort of climate area, a lot of the work seems to be that if we just present people with the facts and say them loud enough and clear enough, that people's behavior will change. And that's, so it assumes that the climate crisis is a knowledge problem, or it's a problem of the head, that once people understand, and the whole of really Western philosophy has been that people don't do what they know that they should do. Why is that? Is it just because they're not as good as Mr. Spock, who sits logically, figures out what the alternatives are and chooses the best option? I read one thing that was in, when I was doing work in that area from, I don't even remember the name, from an early 20th century philosopher in the sort of where ethics had become very esoteric. So it was really about trying to figure out how you would go about deciding what was the right thing to do. And it said, basically, any attempt to then get people to do the right thing, well, that was the job of the pastor. That was the preacher's job, was to convince people to do the right thing. The philosopher's job was to figure out what the right thing to do was. Climate change, we clearly know what the right thing to do is. Maybe not quite what order and how. So yes, I think that's in the science and technology, in science versus theology thing. Theology tends to say much more, these are matters of the heart. These are why you make decisions. My own Christian background is Lutheran, so we very much have this idea that people are simultaneously saints and sinners. And that also is very appropriate for the climate crisis, because we're both perpetrators of the problem, but also people who are trying to solve it. And we need to recognize that we're both of those things at the same time. So in cases like that, I think theology has a lot to offer about how maybe to solve scientific problems.
Yeah, there's just, we've done quite well on time. You've done well, Neil. So there's maybe one last question from Ian. What is the difference between your approach and natural theology of, say, Newton?
Well, so natural theology normally means looking at the world and trying to find God there. So at one level, natural theology says, look at the world, it's so wonderful, it's so beautiful, it's so intricate, it's so well ordered, it can't be an accident. That's probably the biggest, it's either an argument of beauty or an argument of order. That, I think, is weakened quite a lot by scientific discovery. If you try and make that argument that there must be a God because this world is, because we like it, or we see these things in there. That ends up being a sort of God of the gaps almost argument. More modern natural theology sort of arguments tend to maybe focus a little bit more on the inner world, to say, why are we created? What's the purpose of humanity? Science tells us nothing about what the purpose of humanity is, whereas theology tells us everything about that. So I'm not convinced of whether natural theology tells us, it certainly doesn't tell us about that we can look at the world and identify that there was a Jesus Christ who was a savior who lived at a particular time in a particular place. That's not observable by just looking at scientific explanations of the world. So natural theology tells us that there's a God, but doesn't tell us much about what that God is. So I think my work is quite different to that. It's trying to say, given that we're here and we're doing science and we're living science and we're using science, how does that fit with our Christian beliefs? And how do we, and do our Christian beliefs evolve as a result of our scientific knowledge? Or do we sort of have rigid beliefs, rigid Christian beliefs? And then we say, okay, well, let's massage scientific stuff to try and fit those.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Neil. Thanks for flying down from Brisbane and all your research and preparation. It's really been really great. Thank you.
Thank you.